sublime. Back to the portion the world cannot know. Bethel is calling, and I must go. Back to Bethel, I must go. Back where the rivers of sweet waters flow. Back to the true life my soul longs to know. Bethel is calling, and I must go. Back to the prayer life in Christ I once knew. Back to the beautiful life-cleansing dew. Back to help others to conquer each foe. Bethel is calling, and I must go. Back to Bethel, I must go. Back where the rivers of sweet waters flow. Back to the true life my soul longs to know. Bethel is calling, and I must go. Amen. Brother McCrae, would you ask the Lord's blessing on the offering, please? Amen. You may be seated. My favorites. Thanks. Tonight's our final night. I hope we brought some notepads and something to write with and jot notes. And so without any further ado, Brother Sal, thank you again for coming. You're up.
All right. Microphone is working, and I think it's hanging in the right place here. So we'll go from there. Let me thank you, first of all, for allowing me and my wife to be here. She is kind of immobilized tonight. You know, when you get to be our age, you have trick things. You know what I'm talking about? Which means like they work fine and then surprise. Well, and that's kind of where we live. And so she's a little incapacitated tonight. And so she asked me to send her thanks and appreciation for being part of your group this week. And it's been a blessing to both of us. And I assure you, your pastor and his family are good people. And being in the ministry, you get around. And I'm not saying they're bad people in the ministry, but There are some winners and then there are some losers. How's that? Is that all right? Boy, that's probably the only thing you'll remember about American history. He said there's a lot of preachers that are losers. Not meaning that, but I just mean there's some stellar folks. And your pastor and his wife and family are stellar people. And it is our joy to know them and to fellowship with them. I think I enjoy the fellowship as much as anything when we're together, just talking and eating ice cream and that good stuff. So we started out in Psalm 33:12. And again, I have apologized and not to just continue to be apologetic. It is an impossibility to cover American history in just 4 or 5 nights. It just can't be done. And I know your pastor knew that, and he said, hit the high points. Well, it is impossible to hit the high points in just 4 or 5 nights. And but what I have prayed that God would allow us to do maybe is to just kind of whet your appetite and say, I want to know some things about my country. And I can recall, I loved history. I didn't love much of anything else. I loved history. I had one history teacher that almost caused me to become a mass murderer. But other than that, it was a good experience. And I began to realize at an early stage that just walking around town, you can see history. And some of those, forgive me if I repeat myself tonight on a couple of points because I didn't bring my notes from the other night. But I probably told the story of a lady in our church when we were going through American history sometime, probably 3 or 4 years ago, had taken her kids to the dentist, and she's sitting in the van, waiting on them to get their teeth cleaned and come back out. And one of the doors opened, and the typical guy comes out with about a 4 or 5 day growth of beard and the old veteran's cap on, and he's kind of stoop-shouldered, and he walked past her van, and we had just gone through some of the things in American history. She rolled down her window, and as he walked by, she said, "Sir, thank you for serving our country." And he didn't say or do anything. He just kind of sauntered right on by. And she had her window down just a little bit, and she said, I was adjusting the air conditioner or the radio or something, and all at once I turned around, and he's standing there looking through my window. And she said, I was terrified. Because some of those veterans looked like they just came off the battlefield. You know what I'm saying? And he just stood there and looked at her. And she didn't know what to do, and she said, so I reached over and turned on the ignition and let the window down the rest of the way and said, "Sir, can I help you?" And he said, "You're the first person that ever thanked me for serving my country." And you never know. You never know. And you say, well, that's a wonderful thing. It is a wonderful thing in and of itself. But I submit to you that the fields are ripe and white unto harvest when they mature. And some of these old veterans and some of us old guys now understand that maturity is something that comes with age and wisdom and also a lot of questions. And as much fun as it is to try and teach little boys and girls, yes, Jesus loves me, and get an early start and lead them to Christ, there are a lot of heavy hearts that are wrapped up in 70 and 65 and 60-year-old bodies that have come all the way through life and said, what's worth living for? What was it or has it been all about? And so as we come through here tonight, I would encourage you, like I said, to maybe make it a matter of prayer and to ask the Lord to give you a burden. To give you a burden and just get you some gospel tracts. Maybe just pick up 2 or 3. How's that? Nobody dies from passing out 2 or 3 tracts. Just get 2 or 3, and you say, well, I don't know where to pass them out. I'll tell you a good place that a lot of people don't pay any attention to. Go park in the parking lot at the grocery store. About 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning. That's when the old guys get up and run to the store. Or go to a McDonald's. All the old guys gather at the McDonald's early in the morning, about 10 o'clock, and you can pass out 3 tracts in less than 30 seconds. And you say, well, I just don't know if it'd do any good. You don't. I never have known if it's going to do any good. But you never know that it might do some good, too. There might be somebody turn around and come back and say, I wondered about this all my life. I've had people tell me, I prayed last night for God to bring somebody into my life. And wow, that's one of those divine moments. And boy, that's what we're looking for. That's where the fields are white unto harvest, and the Lord can direct us there. So we've talked about the birth of our country, and we've already apologized about the fact that we certainly can't go through all of history, so we've kind of high-pointed it, and maybe it's been a little bit too hodgepodge, I don't know. But if we've developed in you a taste that says, you know what, I want to know something about my country, I think I can say without fear of being corrected that you're going to find more of God in your history than you were ever taught in school. And it's not like you have to scour the face of the earth to find these little quips and things. You can just go back and look at the writings of some of the founding fathers and realize God was heavy on their hearts as an influence in the things they were attempting to accomplish for the Lord Jesus Christ. And what I wanted to deal with tonight, we got to the Revolutionary War, and in case we didn't mention it the other night, we won. And I know it was probably something you really wanted to understand as we finished up, so I'm just going to cut to the chase. Hope it doesn't spoil the ending for you, but we won, and we have this great country as a reward for it. It's always amazed me that the French and then the English, whoever it happened to be, they're our primary enemies about this time. And if one wasn't fighting us, they were fighting the other one, and we kind of were just always involved in perpetual conflict. That they really didn't know how big our country was. You know, France would fit inside of our country with states all the way around it. And yet it's a place where the population was exploding. They've been there for thousands of years. They've gone to war numerous times over a stretch of land 18 or 20 miles wide and fought wars. And you look at that, they came over here. Didn't they give up awfully easy? You know, they came over here en masse, and we fired a few musket shots at them and exchanged some volleys of fire, and they went home. And same thing with the English. Britannia rules the waves. They own the sea. And yet they just kind of said, we're not going to fight all these people for this country. It's not worth it. Let's go back to good old England and have a jolly old time. I've often wondered in my thinking process, did they really have any idea? You could put France and England 5 times inside the landmass of our country. Do you think they honestly knew about that and said, no, we'll just let these ragtag people have it? I think God kind of blinded the people in a certain way. I think sometimes He just dropped the hand of omnipotence and said, you can't go any further than here. I think He just all the way through. So when we sing America, America, God shed His grace on thee. Realize how true that is. And be thankful. I tend to be the naysayer because I'm living in this day and time, and I tend to look at our country and say it's shot, it's done, it's finished. You can't clean a house that's that dirty. I mean, that's just that's me. Will you forgive me? God can, though. And sometimes that's what I forget. And He did say, if my people, there's a hypothetical there. If my people, which are called by my name. That indicates to me that heaven's outpouring in our country is not something we have to beg God for. I submit to you, He's waiting on us. It's waiting on us. Do you ever tell your children, if you clean your room, you come up with some reward? If you study your homework, if you be good when your dad gets home, we always use that to set up a great promise. And when God said, if my people which are called by my name shall humble themselves, you understand what He's doing there? He's kind of buttering you up to say, listen, Dad's coming home. And there's things that can be accomplished if we just will pay attention. I have little anxious doubt for my country in the sense that it's going to make it. And I say that from a historian's perspective, and I'm not a professional historian, but I've seen enough of how things come and how they decline and how they fall apart. And I see where most of the time cultures and sometimes nations pass a point of no return. And it is perhaps for me a little bit too audacious, but I sometimes feel like we've crossed that line. And so one of two things. First thing I want to bring to your attention is that I don't know. Okay? If you've heard me teach American history, you know I'm not an expert on American history. I'm just the guy that went and got all the books and the tapes and the CDs and the DVDs and got the numbers and all. That's just all I did. I've just assembled some facts. I'm not the experts on countries and how they rise and fall. But I think that Franklin was right when he talked about a nation can't arise without the provident hand of God. But Franklin was really probably just 2 steps away from being an atheist in his outlook on life, and yet he recognized that God could change things miraculously. And so I have to apologize to the Lord quite often, particularly after studying for history, because I become the naysayer. If I were God, did you ever say that? I know some of you didn't do that, but I have done that on occasion. If I were God, sometimes I watch the evening news and I think, if I were God. Sometimes I just, get the drift of what's going on in Washington, D.C., and I think, if I were God. And sometimes we just need to be reminded we're not. And think about it. If you were God, you probably wouldn't have saved you. Amen? Was a hymn writer who said, I once was lost, oh wretched man that I am, Paul said. We all were in a world of hurt, and probably, if we'd have been God, we would have established some criteria by which we couldn't even have gotten saved ourselves. And yet He loved us and saved us by His mercy. So what He's saying, I'm saying, let's take away some history, some facts of how gracious and good and kind God has been to those people that were our forefathers. Let's remember that what God allowed to be established here was established in spite of everything that could have and should have gone wrong. And let's remember that God took that little fledgling group of people, and when they called on His name, He answered them again and again and again and again, and they were never worthy. And with that in mind, let's just go out here and say, God, do it again. Do it again. I remember the old fellow that went away from the camp meeting one time, and he had got his cup full and rejoicing, and went home, and he told his wife, after 2 or 3 days, he said, I miss it. I miss the power of God and the glory of God. And he said, I'm going to go pray. And he went out in the backyard and got down on his knees out there, lifted up his face toward God, and his wife stood on the back porch, and he just looked up, tears running down his face. He said, Lord, do it again. Do it again. Do it again. Wouldn't it be wonderful if God would just do some of the things in our country one more time that He did so many, many years ago? So, as we come to the end of the Revolutionary War, and without having the time to get through, or to and through the Civil War, I think it bears that we deal with the issue of slavery. There is a great divide in our country over the atrocity of the issue of slavery, and it has been one that has remained with us and haunts us to this day, and I believe will haunt us forever. I don't believe that will ever be straightened out in any magnificent form, simply because it was an atrocious thing. It was a terrible thing. But several things I want you to learn, and with not giving any excuses to history, sometimes I look at young people today in the mall and I think, what about their mother and father? They look like morons. And having said that, I remember probably somebody said that about me years ago. So I'm not the guy that knows everything about history that can pass judgment, nor am I the guy that can question what God is doing and why. Because I don't know. I can pray that He will. I can know that He can and ask Him to do it. But I can't cause Him to bring revival or straighten out the ills of our country. And at some point I find out again and again and again from this book that sometimes it goes to a point where God says, that's enough. That's enough. And He may give somebody 100 years to build a boat, but the judgment is set. And so we may be at a place where there is no rectifying our society and our nation, but that doesn't eliminate the need for us to rescue the perishing and care for the dying. More so than ever before. So in 1784, again, this is near the conclusion of the Revolutionary War, and in that format is I want to spend some time with you tonight on this issue of enslavement, enslaving people. 1784. Now, this is long before the war between the states. It was in 1865. So in 1784, Connecticut outlaws slavery. The next year, 1785, New York outlaws slavery. In 1786, New Jersey outlaws slavery. Now, what are you giving us those dates for? To, number one, let you know that it wasn't just the South that had slaves. Okay? Slavery was, and let me go just a little bit further, it wasn't just the colonies that had slaves. All right? Slavery was and has been since the formation of time and the formation of nations with the ability to go to battle and fight and win. Slavery has been a natural outcome of winning a war or a conflict. How many of you know if you fight an army of 10,000 armed and trained soldiers and you defeat them, and in the process, 2,000 or 3,000 of them are killed and a couple thousand of your own. Number one, that leaves you with some problems back home because you're going home with a couple thousand less guys that you came with who are not going to be there to work and plant crops and carry on society at home. And number two, you've got all these guys right here. If you don't do something with them, they're liable to come again and fight with you again. And so slavery became an outcome of war. To the victor belongs the spoils. Okay? So it was not uncommon in any conflict in the then known world and even in our present world. I can name some conflicts going on right now where slavery is part of the issue. To take those that had been part of that opposing force and to say, listen, this is, how many of you know that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were slaves taken out of a conquest in the Promised Land? So, by the same token, I'm not here advocating that we abuse or beat or mistreat slaves. I'm simply making the statement that slavery was a natural outcome of contests against nation against nation. You win, okay? And when you win, these guys that came and shot and killed all your farm animals, and these guys that came and burned your house to the ground, and these guys came and lobbed mortar shells in on you and your battalion, these guys have got to pay for what they've done, and it's not like we just dust our hands off and say, well, okay, we win. It's not like an arm wrestling match where you can do it tonight and be crowned a champion, and tomorrow night you got to do it again. You win a war, you don't want to do it again. You want to make sure your enemy doesn't ever get an idea again to come and fight a war. I think it was MacArthur, I could be wrong on that, said the only way to cease from war is to give your enemy so much war that he no longer has the ability to find war compatible. That's the way to do it. So a sound defeat is the strongest way to ensure that war is not going to come again soon. But having said that, we tend to weave in that we're going to get up here to the Civil War, and I understand the Civil War has, in part, to its cause, slavery, the issue of slavery. But I want you to understand as an American that slavery was already on its way down. And I probably won't get to it tonight, but there are some economical reasons from the federal system in Washington, D.C., why the local governments in some of those states were put in between a rock and a hard place. And we may get to it tonight, we may not, and I'm not justifying slavery, but I'm saying there was a cause, and slavery was something that was recognized, I believe, to the majority, even in the South, knowing that it wasn't the right way to be. Sometimes it's a necessity. Anybody like putting mercurochrome on an open sore? You ever cut yourself, put mercurochrome on it? See, some of you have done it. That's not what you want to do. But you do it anyway. Why? Because you want to make sure that thing doesn't get infected and that it heals quickly. So sometimes it's not the most plausible or wonderful result or answer to a problem. Sometimes it's just a stopgap measure. And by the time we get up here to about the time of the Revolution, slavery has been such a part of the South, and the South has become, it's on its way to becoming what will be known as the breadbasket of America. They're growing crops. They're raising crops that can't be grown in the hills of New England. They're boasting farms that one day will carry America across the Mississippi and on across the plains to the West Coast. They are the breadbasket of America. You say, well, Iowa was nowhere to be found at this time. The South was the breadbasket of the United States. They were responsible for feeding the peoples that packed into the cities of the North just as much as they were feeding their own families. Now, they were doing it for financial gain, and that's good, no problem in that. But the problem comes about when, in order to grow those crops and to put those things in, you've got some cheap labor. Okay? How many of you know that there are 16-year-old boys and girls working in our grocery stores? And some of them are there because they have to be there, because they have to make that money. And if they don't go in, they'll suffer retribution for it. Now, nobody's going to tie them to a post and whip them, but they're going to be yelled at, screamed at, and probably lose their job, and it'll put a mark on their record so that it'll follow them through the rest of their... You know, you can get marks on your record. So again, I'm not drawing a line and saying this is exactly that. I'm just trying to get you to see that the thought process can be kind of in harmony when you realize what else you're going to do. If tonight you had a family farm and you had 6 kids, and your 6 kids were, they were all in the house and they weren't feeling well, but, the wheat crop, there's going to come a big storm tonight, I'm predicting hail, and if the wheat gets hit by hail, you lose it all, you probably wouldn't think anything at all about saying, look, kids, sick or not, you got to go out and pick some wheat out here, get it out of the field. So, please don't think for me in a moment of justifying slavery. I am simply trying to take people back, because we've been raised in a society that these people lived, breathed, and died because they could beat and whip and kill other people. And that's just not the way it is. Okay? There were those instances. Okay? Well, let me help you again. There are men that kill their wives. Okay? There are mothers that abuse their children. That doesn't mean that that is the status quo. So having said that, I'm not justifying slavery. I simply am trying to help you understand how we got into this mess. And here we are. So, when Connecticut outlaws slavery, it is not long before New York as a colony outlaws its slavery. New Jersey outlaws its slavery. What is that? It's the dominoes are beginning to fall where we're realizing this is not going to stand the test of time. And we go to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. We have the French Revolution in 1789. All of these things taking place in the context of our Revolutionary War, meaning what? God is pouring a lot on this new-found country, and most of it good, some of it tolerant, and some of it He's judging a little bit. And that is the history of the foundation and the moving forward of our country. I could find you examples of bad things happening. I could find you examples of great things happening. For instance, in 1791, we have what we call the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which is the strongest treatise in the world on human rights. That's not something they just did 2 weeks ago. You know, there are other countries now. We have United Nations today, gazillion dollars. I looked today and saw what we pay for the United Nations. We could probably end world hunger if we just took the money and put it into poor people's pockets. But having said that, somebody's always got to be out there to get us an answer. We could solve those problems, and those problems would go away, but somebody comes up with a great idea. And usually when somebody comes up with a great idea and enforces it on an entire community, state, or country, it's because they got their hand out. Okay. I didn't bring the numbers tonight, but I perused through some of the things, what it costs us to belong to the United Nations. I submit to you, we probably could end hunger in America with what we pay the United Nations every year. You say, what are you saying? I'm not saying yea nor nay. I'm not saying good, bad, or ugly, none of those things. I just think as Americans we ought to understand before we jump on a bandwagon and say, that's horrible. There are probably 8 or 10 other things we don't even think about are horrible too. And I'm not saying that that makes this one thing right. I'm just saying if you're going to jump on your horse and fire your 6-gun in the air about that issue, maybe you ought to look around at some of these other issues as well as an American. And when it's time to vote, or when it's time to elect somebody, or when it's time to put somebody in a position of authority, say, okay, yeah, let's not just ride this horse over here. Let's talk about this one and that one, and oh yeah, the one that you started, the one that you were part of. We're solving the world's problem today with global warming. And I'll tell you what you're doing. You're about to break the economic system of the United States. I'll tell you who's paying to combat global warming. The United States of America. You say, well, you know, If you look at what we put into the United Nations that filters over there, if you look what we put into these other countries that filters back into that, if you look it's just a disaster. So, well, preacher, what do you think? I really don't think anything about it because I love my country. I've been thankful I've been able to live here. I intend to live here the rest of my life and enjoy the goodness and mercy of God. But this is not all there is. I have a home beyond the river. No sickness, no death, no dying, no crying, no pain, no evil. That's where I'm going, see? This is kind of like my vacation home. And every once in a while I come to my vacation home and the bears have gone in and ransacked it and I got to clean it up. But I've got another home. So as God's people, I'm not saying don't participate in the political process. We need to. If something is right, vote for it. If it's wrong, vote against it. That's what my folks would say. And you say, well, if you look at it, be careful about people who want you to look at it from another way. Okay? So I know what it looks like, but I'll tell you what they're doing. They're putting a blindfold on you. And when they're done putting the blindfold on you, you go, okay, now I see. No, you don't see now. So you just fell for it. If it don't look good, don't vote for it. That's just the way it works. I know people that call their local polling stations to find out who's running and who they think they should vote for. Well, welcome to America. Anyway, so 1789, the French Revolution is taking place. 1790, the Second Great Awakening takes place in our country, which is the second revival to sweep through our nation in 40 years. You understand, in less than 40 years, revival, national revival had come to these colonies. People getting saved, born again, churches being filled up. Just prior to us going into this conflict in the Revolutionary War and just a few years beyond it, God put his hand down and said, look, I'm going to make sure my people can keep their senses about them and realize what's important. So a second great awakening takes place. 1791 is where we began tonight with the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is without a doubt as important as anything stated in our Constitution. And you can tell the guys that wrote it exactly what they had in mind. I've got a couple books. I just perused one of them today. And it was their attempt to teach folks what their thoughts were about the way the country... No. Congress shall make no law. When somebody writes that, what do you think they're thinking? Who do you think that's going to mess it up? Congress shall make, they 4 or 5 down, everyone, Congress shall make no law. Congress shall make no law. Who were they worried about? Yeah, obviously not Europe. They'd taken care of Europe. They were worried about themselves committing suicide in the country. And so they put down those Bill of Rights, as we call them, and I submit again, and I think there are many that would agree to me, that is the most important document that our country has ever had to its benefit. Because it spells out. And it's interesting because if you want to know who to distrust, look at usually the first or second word of each one of those amendments. Congress shall not. Congress shall not. Congress shall not. I have met several congressmen in the course of my life. They've all seemed to be pretty good men, and I think probably on an individual level they're mostly good and moral men. It's when you get people together. And you get them together and you start throwing things back and forth and all at once, it just doesn't fly right. That's why we have the ability in our country to elect those people. And to be honest with you, this is personal. Just take it as that. I'm for term limits on pretty much everything. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's one thing that our forefathers recognized early. So, man, the time you've been in Congress 15, 20 years, you can't even smile without it being crooked. It's just kind of the way, I mean, if you can go up there and you come out of the poor cities, you worked in the iron works in Philadelphia or wherever it might be, and you've gone to Washington, D.C., and 4 years later you're a multimillionaire. And I know what your salary is. Something ain't right. So, the Bill of Rights is set up not to empower government, but to empower you and I. So if a congressman shows up at my door and says, listen, we just passed a law. Shut the door and say, Congress shall make no law. You can't get my gun. You can't do this. It's limited what you can do. So Somebody said, I don't like guns. Neither do robbers. It's an amazing thing. Matter of fact, you don't even need a gun. You can do it with a piece of paper. You can put a piece of paper on your front door that says, I have guns. And they won't like that piece of paper either. So even if you don't have guns, put up a piece of paper that says, I have guns. And it works just fine. Forgive me, I'm working hard to draw this all to a close, trying to give you an appreciation for the Bill of Rights. When it was all said and done, we have the most wonderful document, probably politically, that's ever been published in our Constitution. It took geniuses to put together the framework that allowed certain rights reserved to the states, certain rights reserved to the people, certain limits on the federal system. Those things were just magnificent when they were put together. And you understand, most of those guys were not overtly educated. Most of them were farmers. They weren't guys that owned big, huge corporations and businesses. They were dirt farmers. And they were as cautious to put somebody in an office that would come and take their crops as they were to allow somebody else to come in and take. They didn't want a system set up where that stuff can flourish. So our documents were put together in that sense. And I say again, right in the context of that, 1791, the Bill of Rights was put together and ratified over the next 6 or 7 years. 1791. 1790 was the Second Great Awakening. Remember, we had a Great Awakening going into the Revolutionary War, where folks got right with God and they were somehow excited, and it gave them the ability to march into war and lay their own lives at stake to win a country. And then again in 1791, they laid out the Bill of Rights. Why? To carry us through again another rough tide. This is the time when guys like Johnny Appleseed and those stories that we hear about back in those days, they begin to launch out and throw a sack across their back of just what clothes they had, and usually a Bible, and head out over the mountains. My wife is German, and her family came from Germany, but came from Germany very early in our country's history. I'm not sure exactly when, but I know they found a book at one point that circulated a little bit through the family that had been written by, Aunt Lucy's great, whatever. But they described coming into Ohio back in the early days, and a little girl who could write. She had penned different things like a diary on a day by day. And one of the things she kept saying was, we have not seen the sun today. We have not seen the sun today. And I think it goes for a period, maybe 13 or 14 days, where just traveling in a wagon with all the goods they owned, trying to get somewhere, they couldn't see the sun. And it had nothing to do with clouds. It had to do with the thickness of the trees. They never got out of the shadow of the trees. They couldn't see the sun. It's an amazing thing. It's an amazing thing to realize, first of all, that our country once was that pristine. But even more importantly, that people had such liberty and freedom, they were willing to challenge the unknown and say, thank God for an opportunity to build us a home and to raise our family, and to whatever it is, we'll deal with it together, to form communities. Most communities were formed around a church. That's how they were formed. You go down south, you can drive around the town square, or you'll drive around a great big church. And that's just the way it was. They put the town square where they put the courthouse, or they surrounded it by a church building. Our country now begins to grow and to flourish, but again with that idea that was still resonating in their mind. Why do you keep repeating that, preacher? Because we live in this 20th century. And if we talk about building a city, we think about zoning ordinances and putting in paved roads and building an airport and all of that other stuff that has nothing to do with what was powering and purposing these people. These people were thanking God for an opportunity to go somewhere and start. I remember my wife, we listened to books when we travel. Follow the River, I think was the name of the book. And it was the story of a woman and her daughter, I believe, that were captured by Indians in Virginia and by the Shawnee. And if I'm not mistaken, it was 7 or 8 years before they could get back home. But when it was time to get free, she had always been taught, as a wife of one of these guys raising crops and just trying to eat by in a settlement over there, if you get lost, find the river and follow the river, and it'll take you to people. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was almost 3 years for them to get back home. following the river. And she talked about it being so dark that you couldn't see the sun. The trees were so thick. So that's the kind of an area where people are growing, but they're no longer challenged by opposing governments and by overbearing rules about religion. That's what still defines Europe. These people now are facing new hostilities, yes, probably every much as dangerous, but they're free from the ones that bound the hands of every European for years and years and years, and that is a church that says you must do this and this and this, or a king who says you will do this or this or this. They now are free. They now are free. And it's just something about it. When you're facing your own obstacles and you're fighting your own battles, you can do it with a renewed vigor that you can't when you're fighting somebody else's. So here we go. We're marching ahead. I say again, Johnny Appleseed comes across there. They say that there are still apple trees bearing fruit in these days and times that probably Johnny Appleseed planted. Apple trees can live a long time if they're cared for. So I don't know how you do it, but there they are. That's what they say. The capital is moved from New York City, which is where it first was, and is now moved from there to Philadelphia. And not to D.C. yet, but moved to Philadelphia. So that's why our forefathers meet there in Philadelphia to put together those great documents that we have, where they meet to argue things. And so the capital of these new colonies, or the United States as they are called at this point, is now down in Philadelphia. Names come to front at this point, like Jefferson and Adams and all of those things that are going on. We tend, if we're not careful at this point, to forget that there is an overlap. How many of you know that John Quincy Adams, who is the son of John Adams, served in Congress with a young man that would later on become the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln? And Abraham Lincoln was there as just a very, very young man, and John Quincy Adams was there as a very, very old man, and they served together. And the interesting thing about that is John Quincy Adams was almost despised, because it is said that every day when the legislature was in session, they actually passed legislation to not allow John Quincy Adams to introduce legislation. Because every day he had the opportunity, he would propose legislation and enter it in for the abolition of slavery. Every single day he was there. And they finally got fed up with it. And so they would not allow him to introduce legislation unless it was new. Those shenanigans probably still go on. The story is phenomenal, because if you ever get a chance to go to the capital of the United States, how many of you have been to the capital of the United States? You should go. Everybody should go, just to see it. And while you're there, make sure you go to the old rotunda, which is part of the original Capitol, where John Quincy Adams and those guys would have sat and passed legislation. And in that it's like the big rotunda when you look up and see forever up that way, and all the pictures and the paintings are around here. And just off to the side of that is the other rotunda, which was the original. And you can go in there. There's an interesting thing about that rotunda. When you get in there, there's a spot that for whatever reason cannot be explained due to the architecture. They'll show you a spot if you take one of the tours, and they'll have you stand here, and then they'll have somebody come way over here the other side, and they'll find a spot and say, now you stand right here. And they'll say, now you start saying something, start quoting something. And the person over there, if they're standing on that spot, can hear every word you say on this spot. If you go here, you can't hear it anymore. It's just the way the rotunda was built. And the echo's phenomenal. But they come to realize that over here on this spot was a place where John Quincy Adams would sit. That's how they found out this thing existed. Because they always thought, this guy, how does he know what we're going to say? How does he know what we're thinking? But it was probably, nobody can say with certainty, but because he sat over there on that spot so often. They finally passed a resolution that John Quincy Adams was no longer allowed to bring legislation to the floor because of his insistence again and again and again on, we've got to get rid of slavery. Story I heard probably less than 2-3 years ago while I was there in the Capitol was they talked about Abraham Lincoln being there as just a freshman congressman, just, still wet behind the ears kind of guy. And John Quincy had taken him under his arm, under his wing. And one day they found one of the little antechambers that you can still see right there. It's right through this door over here. And Adams was getting sick, And he was going to die within the next few days, but he pulled that young man from Illinois over there, and they sat and they talked for just a while. And when he came out, obviously, within a day or so, he fell gravely ill, never recovered consciousness, and was gone. And so the talk of the legislature was, what did he talk to you about? And, you know, the rail splitter, skin and bones Abraham wouldn't tell him. He said, that's between me and him. But Abraham Lincoln served one term and went back to his home state, and then came back in 1860 and set the slaves free, which was John Quincy Adams' passion. One of the first things he did as President of the United States was to pass the Emancipation Proclamation and say no more slavery. Why is that important? Because I think if we're not careful, we get the impression that every American was some kind of a racial bigot that wanted to destroy the black race and hated them, and that's not true. The majority of our country was opposed to slavery throughout its existence here. There were those that relied on it for their vocation. I'm not saying they were right, but I understand that that was probably the wrong answer times 10, but I understand how someone might come to that conclusion. I'm not justifying it. But I want you to understand there were as many people and more times 10 that were opposed to slavery in this country than were for it. America was never a slave nation in the sense of conscience. As a matter of fact, you can read some of the old writings of the Deep South where they were starting to get rid of their slaves. I would love to say because they believed slavery was wrong, but a lot of them recognized the economic cost of all that was involved was not producing any cheap labor for them. So it was a time of turmoil in our country. There have been numerous times of turmoil in our country. Sometimes the time for deliberation is taken away from us. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, there was not a lot of hype that needed to be given. Americans were ready. That we didn't have to be convinced. We didn't have to be begged or pleaded. They didn't have to beg Congress to fund. It was done. You treat us that way, we'll show you the wrath and the might that we have. Somebody said, you're a bully. If we're a bully, we sleep 90% of the time. If you don't want to see the bully side, don't mess with us. Don't mess with us. And that's true to this day. But that's the tendency of America, is to look at something and go, oh, that was horrible, and everybody was, every Southerner was that way, or every Northerner was that way, or that's just the way they... America is a diverse... If you get 15 people in one room, you'll have 15 different diverse opinions about any one given topic, because that's being an American. Okay? And the neat thing about Americans is we eventually come together. We eventually get it right. And somebody may lose the game and they may kick dirt when they walk off the field, but we got to play the game. And it becomes the national pastime. That's kind of the way things work in America. We are Americans first. We can disagree. There are things in my country that I disagree with completely. I don't think anybody that's over 25 years of age ought to have to pay taxes. Yeah. See? I knew you was on my side. That kind of startled you. That's just the way it is. I think as the income goes up, they ought to raise the level of taxation. I think when you become a millionaire, I think about 90% ought to do well. And I think the guy that chooses where that money goes has to be one of those guys paying at the 90% level. I don't think there should be any deductions for somebody in Congress. These are opinions, all right? Some of you are looking at me like, this guy's crazy. I know I am. But you understand the reason we can say these things and talk this way is because we're Americans? Okay? Nobody's going to go out tonight, pass out guns, and we're going to storm the Capitol. It's not going to happen. But we can talk about it. We can bellyache about it. We can go up there and get a sign and put up a sign and talk about those morons in Congress, and they can't do a thing about it. What does that mean? That means we're free. And if we don't like the legislation, at least we can bellyache about it and try to get others to bellyache. And if we get enough people to bellyache, then we'll get rid of that guy. And that's the way that things ought to work. But Lincoln's last few moments with John Quincy Adams were things that were impressionable upon him for the rest of his life. And he said, I will not tell you what we talked about. It's between me and him. But when he came back to Washington years later, his first footsteps were to say, we're going to get rid of slavery. I often wonder if that old man somehow in his dying breath recognized that here's the hope. And that's the wonderful thing about America, is there's always a place where there's hope. Why? Because it's not they, the people, and it's not him, the person. It's we, the people. It's we, the people. And it's our God and country. And we can, with those things in mind, accomplish great and wonderful things as we move along. Alexis de Tocqueville, French guy. The French were really messed up. And, we were going through revolution and putting our country together, and they were chopping heads off. That was their answer. Just lob them off, And so before you criticize America, just think about what had happened if you'd lived in France, But he came to visit America because even from its onset in Europe, remember we came from Europe. Remember we started over there where churches were killing people and burning them at the stake and severing heads because they didn't fit the status quo of religion in those countries. Things have changed over here now. And when word begins to get back over there, de Tocqueville comes to just see what's going on. Here's what he said: on my arrival in the United States, the religious aspect of the country was the first thing that struck my attention. So this guy's a politician. He's been in politics all his life in Europe. He's traveled all over the world. But now that we're a country, he comes back to America. And the thing that strikes his attention is America's religious attitude. He said, and the longer I stayed there, the more I perceived the great political consequences resulting from the new state of these things. In other words, I came and I understood this was what they had founded their country on. And the longer I stayed, the more I realized it worked. I submit to you, we are a great nation because, if not now, at least we were a nation trying to be in tune with God. A nation that was concerned with what God had said, and maybe not always following to the letter what God had commanded Israel or the Gentiles to do, but at least observing the fact that if God thought this was the right way, then we should consider this. And understanding that when we had erred, we need to straighten our error out and straighten out the problem. If we broke it, we needed to fix it. That was the mindset. If we had an opportunity, we seized it. We gave it our all. We put everything we had into it. We had a work ethic. We cared for our neighbors. We were concerned about what was going to happen somewhere else other than just in our own homes. They didn't have TVs. Today we know more stuff than most of those colonists knew in 25 or 30 years of their lives. And we get it in one afternoon. And none of it means anything because we never do anything about any of it. We just sit and grumble and complain and then tune in tomorrow night to see what else we need to murmur and grumble and complain about. See, these colonists found out that somebody had felled a tree over here on his land and it had fallen on his foot and crushed his foot, and he was laid up, and for the next 5 or 6 weeks people would show up every day with food. They'd come over and help make sure that the tree was down and that the crops got planted. They'd work together to help each other. They weren't looking for another problem to bellyache about. They were looking for a problem they could solve. And that pulled America together in such a way that we, strangely enough, all resemble each other. Red, yellow, black, or white. All Americans just kind of resemble each other. I've been in Europe a number of times, and they tell me, and it had been my experience, they can tell an American in 15 seconds. I don't know how. I remember one time going into a place, over there they have a place for the green eye. Anybody been over there? If you're traveling on the highways and you don't know how to go, the green eye, it would be like a rest area here. But in the rest areas over there, or in the green eye, they have people there, it's information. And I remember stopping in one of those as we were traveling one day, and I went in, and there was a young lady down here, you could tell she was going 90 miles an hour in some foreign language, Swahili, I don't know what. And they were back and forth. And then when she got done, they walked away, and she turned to another guy, and she and it's another language. And then she looked at us over here, and she said, Americans? I don't know if that was an insult or a compliment, but she said it in perfect English. You had to be able to speak 3 languages fluently to work in those places, and it was like a rest area. How many of you ever seen a guy cleaning the restrooms at the rest area? Okay, in Europe, you have to speak fluently 3 languages to clean the restrooms, evidently. So we wonder why we're so far behind. But Americans have a different mindset in that sense, in that when times are tough, we'll pull together and we'll not cop an attitude and say, oh well. We'll band together and we'll solve the problem. A number of years ago, I was at Normandy with some preachers and stopped and visited where some of those pillboxes still stand, where our troops were embedded, and when our boys landed and the Germans were embedded there. And you still see them today, still the bullet marks and the potholes and everything you can see. And we just kind of strolled. I had 6 or 7 preachers with me and saw Pont du Hoc and saw the hill where the Rangers climbed straight up an escarpment of nothing but jagged rocks. And the Germans would just stand up there and drop hand grenades again and again and again. And they'd fire another, rappel up again. And finally they got to the top. That's why the Rangers battalion became so impressive in the United States Army, because they just didn't quit. But we walked around up there for a while, and this is probably, I'm guessing again, my dates and synchronization is not what it used to be, but it was before 2000, so probably 1998, somewhere in there. And we came up and finished touring around there and looking at all those places, and there's just nothing for miles. That's all now just kind of like what we would consider a national park. There's a cemetery down there, I think, with 20-something thousand American graves. You can stand and look at every row. It's just lined up perfectly. Everyone's got a flag. They're well cared for. They're not forgotten. But as we came up through there, I told the guys, I said, wow, I said, it's getting late. I said, we need to find a place, and we need to find a place to eat. Well, and there was a little place over here. It wasn't any bigger than maybe your foyer out there. And it was the only place you could see for miles, and it had a little light flashing, and so we went to get something to eat. And there was a little Frenchman that owned it. And when we went in, it was interesting because he couldn't speak a word of English, and we couldn't speak a word of French. And but he was not going to let those Americans go. No. He'd come and he'd pull out a chair and on the table, you sit down. He didn't say that. Well, have a word. And we sat down, and he brought us some water out, and we sat there and drank, and he understood Coca-Cola. He had that. And so we sat there and we talked, and as we talked, there was a picture up here on the wall, just probably 11 by 14 maybe, of 2 GIs, black and white photograph, got their helmets cocked on, and kind of got their heads together smiling. And the story was underneath it. It was a caption from an American newspaper. So it was in English, we could read it. It talked about these 2 guys that on D-Day had, under the hail of fire that was going on, found their way into a bunker where they were out of the line of fire, never had met each other before, and they spent the next 3 or 4 hours in that bunker, bunkered down or hunkered down under that fire. They had become friends. And not too long before we had gone there, they had gone back together. Old guys now, with the ball caps. And they had found that bunker, and they had gone down, and when they were in that bunker, they had carved their initials. And the picture was of those 2 old guys now standing and pointing at their initials. That in and of itself was prize-winning. But we sat there, and I asked the guys, I said, guys, I didn't see any bunkers around here. There's great big gun emplacements, but did you see any bunkers? And we were chatting and back and forth, and no, I didn't see anything about a bunker. We got a little guide. There's nothing about a bunker. And this little French guy, he's got the typical white little robe. He looks like the French waiter. He comes back around. It's his house. His kids are over here watching television, and we're sitting here drinking coffee. He comes and goes, bunker, 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 bunker. And he does this, and we get up and we follow him, and he goes around a corner. He takes us past the bathroom, and we go down the hallway, and here's a bedroom with the beds unmade, and we go down to the end of a hallway, and there's a door with an iron bar across it, and he lifts this iron bar and sets it in the corner, and he opens the door, and he takes us down into the bunker. And he's pushing boxes aside, and I don't know where the guy came from, but he must have been there drinking coffee or something, because now he's joined us down in the bottom, and we now have a translator. And this little Frenchman starts to weep, and the tears start running down his face. And the story was this: he was 9 years old when the Allies landed. And he said by then the Germans had killed every head of cattle within 40 miles. All the cows, all the pigs, they had all been killed to feed the German army. All the crops and all the goods that were there from the fields had been taken long since and eaten by the German soldiers. And he was 9 years old, and his family was starving to death. And as he's talking, he keeps looking back over toward that beachhead there. And all at once he looks out there and he does this, and his face lights up. And he's got a smile from ear to ear. And we don't understand, but he starts going boom, boom, boom. And I knew what he was talking about then. Those Allies were coming ashore. Boom, boom, boom. And finally, he's talking, and the guy said, he just wants you to know how thankful he is for America. And he turned around. This is going to be unusual. And he grabbed a wine bottle and he handed it to me. And he does the little, And so here I am, a Baptist preacher, giving a tour for other Baptist preachers, who now has been gifted a wine bottle. And he keeps passing them out to all these preachers. And they're looking at me like, what have you gotten us into? And I said to the fellow that had come out of nowhere and was our interpreter, I said, would you please tell this gentleman we so much appreciate that he loves our country, because we do too. And I'm glad that we had the opportunity as a country to set his country free. But we don't drink, and we just would. And he looked at me and he said, he didn't tell the little guy. He said, oh, it would kill him. He said he loves America. He's just trying to tell you he's thankful. So at home, I have an empty wine bottle. It was emptied before we ever left the town. I have an empty wine bottle, and if anybody ever asks me, I just let them know that's what people think of America, enough to give all they have, because we did our best to try and set somebody free. The story of America today is grim, because we've thrown out our heritage. We've ceased to try to be what we think ought to be. We've become self-centered and self-concerned, and it's about me and mine, and I got to get mine, and as long as I get mine, I don't care what happens to anybody else. I'm striving to get to the top of the heap, and we've forgotten that we are one nation under God. And if we are not under God, we are not one nation. We have lost that, and we struggle. I would encourage you as we move forward to find something and read an old book. Find something historical and read it, just to get a glimpse of how they lived in those days and how they acted and reacted. I think that American spirit is still there and still alive. If you go to Europe today, you'll still find, if you can find some of those old gray heads, some people that love your country. I rode with a young man in England, not a young man, he was probably in his 60s when I was there, but he was a 9-year-old boy. And I asked him, we had just gone into Winston Churchill's bunker, which still stands completely intact, hasn't been touched, just as it was in World War II. And as we came out, I asked him, I said, how old were you? And he said, I was 9. I said, do you remember much about the war? And he said, oh yes. He said the Germans would send the Luftwaffe across the harbor, across the bay. He said they'd come and strafe the school children a couple times a week as they got out of school. I never realized that. I didn't know that. But those civilians there, boys and girls going to school, become the targets for that atrocious. What are you saying? I'm saying there's some atrocities in this world that we don't have to be a part of. There's some atrocities in this world. I had a gentleman that I knew very well in my church. I Didn't lead him to Christ, but I helped him make sure of his salvation. Jim Cashin. Jim Cashin was a bull turret gunner on a B-17, flew 36 missions over Germany in World War II. That was the 100th Heavy Bombardment Wing, the most heavily casualty inflicted on any other unit that was theirs. Square D on the tail. There were times, there was a little poem there at Thorpe Abbott in the air base, what was left of it, and I toured through, and there was a little poem. I wish I had that poem. I'd give everything to have it. All I remember is it started with 13 planes took off today, and it talks about the skies above and sailing through the clouds, and then verse after verse after verse. And I still remember the last one. It was 13 planes went off today and climbed to the sky above. But when they returned back to home base, there was only one. And they said in a little article underneath that happened multiple times, where 13 B-17 bombers took off fully loaded, and one came home. Somebody paid a price. I think if we could keep several things in mind, and this is what I want to close with. Number one, God's the orchestra. He's the one that leads the orchestra. Everything that's happened has been because He orchestrated it or He allowed it to happen. And so it's imperative that you and I walk with God. And number two, and don't forget this one, there are people tomorrow you'll walk past within 5 or 10 feet that are carrying scars. Scars that are the only things they have left from Southeast Asia, from somewhere else in the world, because they're carrying those scars. Just keep that in mind when you get ready to hand somebody a gospel tract, and realize everybody's got a hurt and a story. Some of them, I would wish that they were my story, but most of them, I'm glad they're not. I'm thankful God saved me. I'm thankful that God spared me from some of the things I would have had to gone through, perhaps. I started a Bible college the same time they changed the draft age, and I would have been probably within the next 3 or 4 weeks on my way to Vietnam. I did not go to Bible college to get out of the draft. That's always what I'm asked. God called me to preach when I was 16. I preached my first sermon when I was 16, and I graduated from high school a year early at 17 so I could go off to Bible college. And so I just had gotten to Bible college, and the draft would have been effective to me. And the only deferment they allowed for just a short period of time was if you were in college. So I didn't go to college to get out of the draft. And to be honest with you, to this day, that's one of the regrets of my heart, that I can't say I served my country. So I do my best here to do that. My father served. Our son served. And so we're a family that supports and believes in what our military can do for our country. But I pray for them too. I pray for the gentlemen and the ladies that serve our country in uniform. I pray for our civic leaders. I pray for our governors. I pray for our president. I pray for the Congress. You say, well, boy, you sure talk bad. I just want you to realize that without God, none of this really has any answers. That doesn't mean we shouldn't pray. God, get in there and help them to make a mistake and do something you want them to do. If it's something they don't want to do, make them do it if it's what you want them to do. But we still are the most blessed nation on the face of the earth. Without a doubt. I have been to some beautiful countries. I have seen some beautiful sights that would rival any beautiful thing you'd see in our country. Not exceed it, but rival it. But I've never met a place where I felt like I feel when I'm in America. And I'm thankful that God did and still does shed His grace on this country. If I encourage you in anything, don't stop here. I just skimmed the surface. Go back and find some old books and realize what's going on. I want to close with a story, and I'll be done. I've got plenty of stories, but this is the one that I think of most often. The story of a man who was a writer for Columbus Dispatch, if I'm not mistaken. He wrote feature stories, and he one day decided he was going to write a book and do some studies into those that had served our country, and he makes his way around looking for some of these GIs. Anyway, the end result of that is he finds Paul Tibbets, who was the pilot of the Enola Gay that dropped the atomic bomb on Japan. And he interviews Paul Tibbets, and there are several chapters in there about this man. And the thing that stuck with him and the thing that he wrote most in that book was he was the most unassuming man you'd ever met in your life. He said you could have sat down and talked to him about the weather for 2 hours and never once have known that this was the man that ended World War II with the push of a button. And in that book, he talked then, because of the demeanor of Paul Tibbets in the interviews, he went back to his own father, who he had been estranged from as a boy because his father had been a drinker and woke up at night screaming. And he began to mend those fences, and it was then he realized that his father had his own stories that he had hidden for so long. And in that process, all of that comes together to him. He won a Pulitzer Prize for writing the book, so I recommend it highly. It's a good book. But he talks about when he was receiving his prize for literary, he said, I'm on a stage and there's 5,000, 6,000 people there. And they're going to tell them that I'm the greatest author of this period of time or whatever and give me an award. And he said, here's what defines America's military heroes. He said, they're all cheering for me, giving me a standing ovation. And right here sits Paul Tibbets, the man that ended the war. And nobody knew who he was. And that's kind of the way it ought to be, shouldn't it? There's something about that that encourages us as Americans. That people will do the right thing, not to be recognized, but because it's the right thing. People that will read their Bible and serve God, not because the preacher jumps up and down and runs up and down the aisle, but because it's the right thing to do. Moms that'll pray for their kids before they go to school. Dads that'll lead their families in prayer. Not because they have to, but because it's the right thing to do. People that'll get up on a Sunday morning and make their way to church and find a pew and sit down and sing to the top of their voices. Not because they have to, but because they're free to. Thank God for America. Thank God for our history. And let's not let it fall. I haven't given you all there is to have. There's much more you'd be amazed to find out. So stay after it. Preacher.
My wife and I were in France with the Castellots. I thought about that story, Frenchman and the bunker. And there's a point to this. There was a lady in their church who was Parisian. Her mother lived in Paris. And of course, her mother being older, we gathered there. We were going to spend the night at her apartment. Her mother wanted Sonia and I to take her bedroom. We said, no. And she insisted. We felt awkward, but she was an older generation. Now, I got to tell you, Paris, when we went, was one of the rudest cities I've ever been in. The younger generation is rude as can be. Snotty and rude. Well, we're there, and they find out Americans. There's a guy down on the lower level of the apartment building. They find out Americans are, and he's got to see the Americans. He makes his way up. They let him in. He's not related, but he heard there were Americans in the apartment building. He comes in and he goes to the first lady. Oh, yeah. And they're coming around. He's coming to me. I'm going, oh, no. You know why he did that? Because he never forgot. He was free because of Americans. Let's go out, and what he said is exactly right. Let's go out with the intent. I thought of the verse over there. Paul said this, or Moses said this. He said, thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee. Thou shalt remember. Number one, you can't remember what you don't know. And if you're going to trust the current generation to teach you about your history, you're foolish. I have several copies. Some of you guys that were in Institute, you saw an old a world history book. World War II is not even in it. You see, why do you go back to the old things? Because there is such a thing as revisionist. I don't like the new books because the new books just tell you something and never give you any kind of a source. I'm supposed to believe it because they said so. Well, who are they? And while they do it, they criticize our land, they criticize our founding fathers. How many heard that Thomas Jefferson was supposed to have fathered a child by one of his slaves? Well, they proved it was wrong by DNA. All right. whoever was making the accusation, they did DNA tests and they proved it was wrong. You didn't hear that latter part, did you? All you heard that he was a scoundrel, because that's all they wanted you to know. Amen. Brother Sal, thank you. First Biblical Conference on American History, and I think we got to the end of it. Amen. If you appreciate it, Brother Sal, would you just give him a hand? Appreciate it. Let's all stand, would you please? Lindsay, run up, would you? Just play something.